My name is Juan Pablo Flores, and I'm a senior program manager here at the GitHub education team, where I oversee a couple of our student developer programs like Campus Experts. And I have the honor of working with students from across the globe to support them on their journey of building communities and teaching others so that they can better prepare before they graduate and start their careers as professional developers. One of the big advantages of working at the education team is that, as Nancy mentioned, we are part of the few teams that hire folks from countries where we wouldn't usually hire. So having people from different regions helps us to have a broader overview of the pain points and barriers that education systems have, while building stronger relations with local institutions, communities, and people. Though nowadays we have more experience, it still presents a few or a series of challenges when we make our first hire in another country. From a manager's perspective, you might need help understanding some of the behaviors that you see, the communication patterns, and the values. On the other hand, for a new team member, it can be frustrating that cultural barriers might stop them from achieving their potential that they know they're capable of. It is quite an important moment in time to consider how other cultures work and how they bring themselves to work as well. After the pandemic, some of the traditional hiring barriers that we used to have to kind of bring people from other countries have been lowered due to remote work and the reduced need to be in the office. So in this talk, I wanted to make sure that I could share with you some of the findings that I've gained through this time, and especially that I wanted to share some of the key cultural characteristics that you can analyze in order to better understand different behaviors on your team and even on yourself. That will help you clarify where they're coming from and how to best respond to them. At the end, this whole thing will be a massive framework that you can use to visualize how culture influences the way that you work and your team as well. Before we move ahead, I just want to be very honest. There is no golden rules to when we speak of these topics, so take everything with a grain of salt. And we want to avoid you thinking that this might be a way for you to kind of like create certain stereotypes about certain cultures, but rather kind of like bringing you with more tools that you can use on your workplace. Now, to clarify how culture works, I wanted to clarify how it impacts our everyday life. And I'm going to be referencing a few authors. One of them is Edward T. Hall, an American anthropologist and expert in intercultural communication. He developed a model to visualize how different factors are involved in our behaviors. And this first model that we're going to be reviewing is the model called the cultural iceberg. And in this model, as mentioned in the title, culture might be seen as an iceberg, where a very small volume of the iceberg remains visible or above the surface, yet most of it remains under the surface, making it hard to see. When we think about other cultures, we pretty much base ourselves in how we perceive, or we think that we perceive other cultures. This is essentially influenced by pop culture and mass media. Unfortunately, we must be aware that these influences, and we must be aware of how this influences us and how it has created an unconscious vision towards what other cultures are without ever experiencing them on our own. In anthropology, this is known as something called collective imagination, and it's a space on our heads where we share our perceptions towards something, and we try to make sense of the information that we have received from media outlets in trying to translate that into the real world. It is kind of like a place where we all have agreed on, some sort of stuff. And an example of this pretty much hits home. So in 2015, James Bond Spectre started rolling out in cinemas. The introduction of the movie shows Mexico City's downtown, and it is filled with people using masks and having makeup resembling the Catrinas in a big parade celebrating the Day of the Dead. Now, if I ask you all if you ever imagined that this is something that would happen in Mexico, I guess like most of you would agree that that is correct. But nothing farther from reality. In fact, we didn't used to have a Day of the Day parade in Mexico City. But since the James Bond movies created this notion that this was a reality, the city government started one because tourists who visited the city during Dia de Muertos came to the city to see the parade. And that's how Mexico City started to have a Day of the Dead parade, thanks basically to James Bond movies. Something very important that I would like to kind of like talk about is that most US films will take over Mexican or Mexico with a sepia film, meaning that they will use filters to make it show like a little bit yellow, which is pretty weird. Trying to, like these movie directors trying to make sure that Mexico looks like a desert where, we have the full spectrum of colors in the city. Um, so above this, let's talk about a little bit about the what's above the surface. And the visible portion of the iceberg is also known as the external culture, which includes things that are explicit in the person's everyday life, such as language, tradition, how you dress, any kind of like material culture, which has to do with how you dress and the things that you buy, and also certain type of behaviors. In essence, these are the cultural characteristics that others can observe and normally interact with. Because of this nature, the visible elements of culture are easier to identify and understand because they are present to everyone around you. Not only that, but as the person in the matter, you are self-aware of these elements, meaning that you get to choose how you present yourself, for example, with clothing and language, but also how you don't present yourself in certain spaces. You are also able to compartmentalize depending on where you're going and who you are meeting. On the other side, we have something called the deep culture, and is characterized by not being understood by outsiders, or is something that is a little bit harder for folks that are outside of this culture to understand. It includes things like values, beliefs, and assumptions. These hidden elements are the ones that secretly drive our behaviors and how we interact with others. For example, a person's values and beliefs play a fundamental role in how they choose to communicate and even make decisions. Culture's hidden sides also profoundly affect our everyday work environment. To no one's surprise, behavioral elements like unconscious bias, gender roles, status designation, and even the mere concept of fairness emerge from these hidden cultural contexts. Yet, a core challenge in deep culture is that very few people are conscious of how these assumptions and elements play a role in the way that they interact with others. This is because we implicitly learn them. These present an additional set of challenges. Since we implicitly learn them, these elements, they are a little bit hard to change where we're trying to, when we try to change our behaviors. Since they are not extremely visible, we need to take additional effort, or just like make additional effort to be able to modify them. Now, in order to characterize some of the items that we have seen in both like what's above and below the surface, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how Hall's culture iceberg theory has been influential for intercultural stories. It emphasizes the importance of understanding the hidden elements of culture to relate with people from different cultural backgrounds. And by understanding deep cultures of the people that we work with and even ourselves, we can gain a lot of insight into the behaviors and the ways of thinking, which can help improve communication and even avoid misunderstanding. It is not an easy task, but luckily enough, we're not the first ones to ask these questions. Most of us understand that values are a result of our culture and serve as a method to judge what is good or what's acceptable and what's bad and what's unacceptable. Gerd Hofstede, a social psychologist who focuses on the study of modern cross-cultural science and thinking, built one of the first databases for statistical analysis through a research supported by IBM in the 1970s, where they surveyed over 170,000 employees in the multiple offices that the company had across the globe. The main goal of this research was to find core values that could help both in management and business to understand the different priorities each of these countries had. After their research, Hofstede team developed a framework, also known as the Hofstede Cultural Dimensions, which initially was built with 5 core dimensions and recently was extended to 6. But for kind of like learning purposes of this talk, let's keep it up to like 5. The first dimension that I wanted to cover refers to power distance, which is the extent to which a society accepts that power is distributed unequally. In other words, it is a measure of how much a culture values hierarchical relationships, where there is a large gap between those who have power and those who don't. Cultures that score high on power distance tend to be more hierarchically, where people accept and expect that there will be large differences in power and status between individuals. In these cultures, there may be a strong emphasis on obedience and respect for authority, and there may be less emphasis on equal participation and democratic decision making. People in high power distance cultures may be more likely to accept that some individuals have more rights and privilege and access to resources than others. On the other hand, cultures that score low on power distance tend to be more egalitarian, where people expect that power and status will be distributed more evenly among individuals. In these cultures, there may be a strong emphasis on equal participation and democratic decision making, and there may be less emphasis on obedience and respect for authority. People in low power distance cultures may be more likely to question and challenge unequal distributions of power. And some of the main characteristics that we've seen, and kind of like how we can compare both like high power distance and low power distance culture, is through the next matrix. So in high power distance cultures, the perception of inequality is kind of like normalized, as we mentioned about before. On the other hand, in low power distance cultures, it is seen as something abnormal and wrong, kind of like something that needs to be fixed within a specific country. On the other side, we have the perception of hierarchies, which more powerful individuals are above the person in high power distance, while in low power distance cultures, hierarchies help to set out order, but there is no superiority involved in the way that they see power. Then we can talk about like the perception of superiors, where more powerful individuals are seen as above the rest in high power distance, while in low power distance cultures, hierarchy only helps to set like the order again. The other thing that we found that was very interesting, and this is supported by this research, is that in education, most of the students and just like overall high secondary level education, respect is the core priority, while in low power distance cultures, independence is one of the core elements that is taught. And last but not least, when talking about work, the relation with the manager in high power distance cultures tends to be about being told what to do, while in low power distance is much more about being consulted about decision making. Now, let's review some of the countries and kind of like how can we position different countries in this index. And essentially, something that I wanted to cover is that power distance is not, let's say, like a global metric, but rather is something that is built on top of comparisons between countries. So in this specific metric, China tends to be the one that scores the highest in terms of power distance. Then we have countries like Russia, Mexico, and India. Italy kind of getting there in the middle. Netherlands in below the little, and the one that has the least power distance in this research was Denmark. Now, how does this is kind of like seen in the culture and just like in these countries. So in countries where we've seen where there's high power distance, income is distributed in an unequal way. On the other hand, low power distances countries are more equal in terms of income. In terms of class, high power distance countries tend to have large low class income, kind of like large low class like societies, while in low power distances, they tend to have large middle classes. In terms of power in high power distance countries is maintained by a very low number of people, while in low power distance countries, it is more distributed across the population. And last but not least, in politics and conflict, fighting is the way to solve it, while in low power distance, politics and conflict is solved peacefully, meaning that people tend to be more diplomatic in these countries. Then the second item that we review in Hofstad dimensions is uncertainty avoidance. When we talk about uncertainty avoidance, this has to do with how individuals react to unclear or ambitious events. And these characteristics require further understanding of what are the rules, the circumstances, and the threats that individuals face. There is a strong relation with how someone manages stress, anxiety, and even activities like reading and traveling. The main characteristics about uncertainty avoidance, and this is separated in high uncertainty avoidance countries and low uncertainty avoidance countries. We can start with the perception of uncertainty, where uncertainty is in high uncertain avoidance countries is seen as a threat or something that is challenging or someone that might be seen as a risk, while in low uncertainty avoidance countries is seen as something novel and generally accepted. As we mentioned before, stress and anxiety might be known as, high in high uncertainty avoidance countries, while in low uncertainty avoidance countries, it is pretty much lower. And at work in these high uncertainty avoidance countries, they stay in a job for a long term or long periods of time. This is pretty much because the folks in these populations tend to be less willing to take the risk of moving between jobs, while in low uncertainty avoidance countries, changing jobs is something that is fairly common. The perception of change in high uncertainty avoidance countries tend to be about like danger and risk, while in low uncertainty avoidance, this perception of changes is more about like curiosity and kind of what they can build on top of that. And last but not least, high uncertainty countries tend to set off rules as a must, so they can have a way in which they can keep order and they can keep themselves kind of like in a certain level that they will feel comfortable with. But low uncertainty avoidance country tends to be, they tend to not like having rules, so they are more willing to be more flexible with rules. In this sense, uncertainty avoiding countries, we have in the high uncertainty avoiding side, we have countries like Mexico, Russia, Japan, France, and MENA, or Middle East and North Africa. In the middle, we have the US and Netherlands, and in the low section, we have Denmark again. Now, something that is very interesting of having these dimensions is that we can start putting them all together. So if we compare uncertainty avoidance countries with power distance, we can start kind of like get some results that we can start analyzing for when we are building these relations and cultures in our organization. So one study that was very interesting is that the perception, what's the perception of organization in these different countries? Now, in low uncertainty avoidance countries and low power distance, organizations such as companies are seen as a market where everyone can be part of, everyone can just be have a voice and make sure that there's like some decision making. In countries where there's low power distance, but there's like a high uncertainty avoidance, they tend to refer to organizations as machine, where everyone gets to be part of this machine and make sure that it is well oiled, but at the same time, they want to make sure that the machine is working correctly so that the results are as expected. On the other hand, we have high uncertainty avoidance countries and high power distance countries such as Latam and Russia, where organizations are in this pyramid scheme, meaning that a few folks have control or power over the rest of the organization, and also they try to keep themselves in that sense, in that relation or in that hierarchy, so that things keep being the same across the time. And last but not least, we have the case of India and China, where there's low uncertainty avoidance, but a high power distance. And this might be something that you have heard in the past, that organizations such as companies are referred to as family. And this is actually quite interesting because countries like India and China tend to have organizations that are family based or that are family businesses. So the whole sense that, because power distance, a very small amount of people tend to have like power, and in that sense, either like families keep power for a long time, or they tend to pass it to the next generation within the same family. But so organizations and companies being described as family is fairly common. The next dimension that I want to cover is long versus short-term orientation. And this refers to the degree to which a society has future-oriented perspectives. In other words, it is a measure of how much a culture values long-term goals and plans versus short-term objectives. Cultures that tend to score high on this score tend to be more patient, persistent, and thrifty. They are willing to delay gratification in order to achieve long-term goals, and tend to be more tradition-minded and and they tend to respect more tradition. In these cultures, people may be more likely to invest in the future, such as education, savings, and hard work. On the other hand, cultures that score low on this metric tend to be more pragmatic and have a shorter time horizon. They are more focused on immediate results and more present in the moment, which makes them less likely to invest in the future. They tend to be less tradition-minded and have less respect for overall traditions. So when we see some core characteristics on both sides, the perception of time and rewards, when there's a perception of a good and evil, long-term orientation, since they see that people kind of have this possibility of evolve and change, they also see the same thing about the perception of being good and evil. People are able to change through time and kind of like create their, either like become like good or become evil as time happens. On short-term orientation countries, this is fixed. And this is because most of these countries, and you can see this in the last kind of like item here in this table, the perception of time is just about like past and present. So definitely the perception of being good and evil is fixed. So they could essentially, moving from one to the other can be really hard. On the other hand, let's talk a little bit about like self-perception, which has to do with how those people in these cultures tend to see themselves. And in long-term orientation countries, they tend to be a little bit more humble, in a sense that they've learned that through time, people are able to change and they're able to grow into the future. But in short-term orientation countries, the perception of self is very much biased toward positive signals. So people tend to only look into the past and the present of their activities, but have a bias towards what are some of the positive results that they have had with the work that they have done. Then last but not least, let's talking about like ethnocentrism, which has to do with, my culture is it like the center of the world, or is it just like part of multiple other cultures? Long-term orientation cultures tend to learn from other countries and from other cultures, while short-term orientation countries tend to be very proud of their country, which makes them a little bit more close-minded about their own culture. When we think about the index, in this case, we're talking about the long-term orientation index, which will effectively benefit, or you'll get like more points in some sort of way to say to those who think or perceive like long-term goals. And in this one in specific, we have China, Germany, and Russia, some of the countries that tend to look for themselves in a long term, and Islamic countries, the US and Mexico as short term orientation countries. Now, there are some ways that you can see this in society. So long term oriented societies tend to score higher on mathematics. Long term oriented societies also score higher in investing and in investments and savings in the future. And short term oriented societies, especially at work, they tend to report in quarters, while long term oriented societies tend to be, they tend to use metrics such as like overall market share. And something that is very interesting here is what is the attitude toward time that these cultures have? And consider, for example, how different historical events and society evolution might change how we develop a relationship about time. For example, countries that were highly impacted by the Industrial Revolution will have a very different relationship with time that those that were not. Think of the results that ringing a bell or using a whistle to set a clear start and end of the day must have had on the people at that time. In essence, they changed from being very flexible with their relationship with time to a more strict one. Going to factories and working on assembly lines pretty much tied them up to a strict work schedule that aimed to maximize efficiency. The study of how culture is affected by time and kind of like how cultures have different relations with time is also known as chronometrics. And there are two very opposing relationships with time. One is related to people that attend multiple tasks simultaneously, also known as polychromic, and cultures that work on a single task at a specific moment of time. There isn't one being better than the other, though nowadays we might think that we're referring to multitask. In this case, we are talking about something completely different, yet more present at work. Think of a time when you set a meeting or a deadline. In countries that follow the monochronic principle, setting up a date and time for a deadline is inflexible. They expect people to be on time or accept a very short extension. So things like arriving 5 minutes late might be seen as a complete waste of their time and even abusive. The same situation happens with the time allocated to meetings. Those who overextend in a meeting can get into trouble even if they extend a few minutes. On the other hand, monochronic cultures generally prefer to schedule another time to gather if the goals of the meeting were not met. By contrast, polychronic cultures have a lax relationship with time. They prioritize people, relationships, and often extend to complete a task. For example, in personal meetings and appointments, there is no judgment nor worries about arriving past the time agreed on, and might have several tasks require their attention simultaneously. If a meeting agenda still needs to be completed or is not fulfilled, they most likely will extend that call in order to make sure that they have covered all of the items. And as you can imagine, both poles are completely opposed to each other, which might generate frictions within a team. The next item that I want to review is individualism versus collectivism, which refers to the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. In other words, it is a measure of how much a culture values the autonomy and self-expression of the individual versus the collective needs and goals of the group. Cultures that score high in individualism tend to be more, individualistic, where people expect to look after themselves and their immediate families only. In these cultures, people tend to have a strong sense of self-reliance and self-expression, and may place a high value on personal freedom and privacy. These cultures tend to have a more competitive nature, where the achievement and success of the individual is highly valued. On the other hand, cultures that score low on individualism tend to be more collectivistic, where people are integrated into strong cohesive groups such as extended families, a clan, or an organization. In these cultures, people tend to have a strong sense of loyalty and commitment to the group and may place a high value in social harmony and maintaining relationships. These cultures tend to have a more cooperative nature where the group success is more important than the individual success. Some of the core characteristics about individualist versus collectivist cultures is that, first of all, in individualist cultures, ties between individuals are very weak, while in collectivist cultures, they tend to be very strong. Identification is a core parameter in both kind of like cultures. So in one of them is the identification is about yourself, while in collectivist cultures, they tend to identify themselves as a group. At work, you might see that tasks come first, so work is a priority, while in collectivist cultures, relationships come first. And last but not least, competition. In competition in individualist cultures, it is between, as you might imagine, between individuals, while in collectivist, it is between groups. Something that is important about collective cultures is that they have a strong impact on communication. So they're pretty much categorized in two types of communication in collectivist and non-collectivist or individualistic cultures. So we have, in one sense, we have high context cultures where people rely heavily on nonverbal cues and share experiences that convey meaning. Communication is often implicit and less reliant on words. Some key characteristics of high context cultures are that people rely heavily on nonverbal cues such as facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language to convey meaning. People tend to share similar backgrounds, experiences, and values, which leads to a high level of understanding and mutual trust. People often use implicit communication, relying on shared understanding rather than explicit instructions or explanations. The communication is highly dependent on the context and the relationship between the people involved. And people in high context cultures these relationships are built on trust and understanding over a long period of time rather than short-term interactions. And some of these examples of high context cultures include Japan, China, Arabic countries, and many indigenous countries, meaning that they tend to be tight-knit groups. In low context cultures, people rely more on words and being explicit with the information, and helps them to convey meaning. This means that communication is often more direct, and some of the key characteristics are that people rely heavily on verbal communication, meaning that they have communications that are explicit and direct. Cultures tend to have a diverse background, experiences, and values, which leads to a lower level of understanding and mutual trust. People often use explicit communication, providing instructions and explanations clearly and directly. And in communication in low context cultures is less depending on the context and the relationship between people involved. Some examples of low context cultures include the US, Canada, Germany, and many other Western cultures. Some examples of individualist, kind of like when we have like a metric or we have like an index on whether a culture is individualistic or they tend to be or they're not, is by measuring them between other countries. In this case, we have in collectivist cultures, countries like China, Russia, Japan, and India, and more individualistic ones are the US, Netherlands, Denmark, and Australia. Something that the way that we see individualist and collectivist cultures is that some of the countries that are part of the individualistic kind of like sense, they tend to be wealthier countries. Collective societies have tend to have limited press freedom, and there are several concerns about human rights. And some collective countries, uh, the use of the word "I" is can be seen as a taboo. What is even more interesting is that when we compare individualism and power distance, um, there tends to be a very direct relation where in countries where there's a low power distance tend to be more individualistic, and countries that have a high power distance tend to be more collectivist. Now, the next dimension is about masculine versus feminine. And this refers to the degree to which traditional masculine work roles are valued. In other words, it is a measure of how much a culture values assertiveness, ambition, and material success versus modesty, caring for others, and quality of life. Cultures that score high on masculinity are expected to be assertive, ambitious, and focused on achieving material success. And these cultures tend to have a more competitive nature where success is defined in terms of wealth, power, and status. In these cultures, there may be a higher degree of gender differentiation where traditional gender roles are more pronounced. And men are expected to be the providers and protectors of and just being the providers and protectors, while women are expected to be caretakers. On the other hand, cultures that score low on masculinity tend to be more feminine, where both men and women are expected to be modest, caring for others, and focus on quality of life. These cultures tend to have a more cooperative nature where success is defined in terms of happiness, well being, and relationships. In these cultures, there may be a lower degree of gender differentiation where traditional gender roles are less pronounced and men and women are expected to share responsibilities and role. Something that is important about this dimension, and I know this might add a lot of noise, is that this dimension should not be confused with gender identity or sexual orientation. In this case, masculine versus feminine cultures, work plays a fundamental role where for feminine cultures, family is a top priority, while in masculine countries, work is a top priority. In feminine countries used to have both father and mother deal with feelings and affection, where in masculine countries, the mother normally is the one that deals with feelings and the father tends to be like at work. Um, in terms of weaknesses, feminine countries tend to be very sympathetic with weaknesses from their own societies, where masculine countries are reject these weaknesses and pretty much isolate people that show these weaknesses. In terms of roles, both genders, both like man and woman, are have the right in some sort of way to say to cry, but neither should fight. While in masculine countries, boys should not show that much of like an emotion and tend more to fight. Last but not least, sex in feminine countries tends to be a way to relate and kind of like relate and build relationships and strengthen those relationships, while in masculine countries, it's a way to measure performance. Um, for these, the Helpside dimensions use the masculinity index, which is what is man-like and woman-like, and countries that tend to have a high index of masculinity. The number one is Japan, followed by Mexico, the US, China, and Italy. Countries that tend to be more feminine are related to the Netherlands, Russia, and Islamic countries. Now, some of the ways that we perceive these societies in our everyday life is that masculine societies have a larger functional illiterate population. Feminine societies aid more to developing countries. Masculine societies blame laziness as the reason behind poverty. And in negotiation, masculine societies focus on salary, while feminine tend to focus more on vacation. I'm adding here an additional dimension to this whole presentation, and this is kind of like the notions of space. So even when we don't think about it, the space where we work and communicate influences how we do so. Beyond office aesthetics, the space between us and others is revealing. And when we're having conversations with friends, we tend to allow them to get closer to us than compared, for example, with a coworker or more obviously a stranger. The study of space and its effect on how far we stand in our relations is often referred to as proxemics, and it evaluates distance in four different categories. The closest of these zones is named the intimate distance, which refers to a space where you can essentially have bodily contact, such as a hug or a kiss. It is a demonstration of great comfort between individuals. Some activities might get people into this zone without us even really wanting people to join these circles. Like, let's say, like a subway that is at capacity. Those of us in this situation might have the tendency to remove ourselves to get released from certain violations of our personal space. Then we have the personal distance, and this is generally a distance where you would have friends and family. There's social distance that is related to coworkers, where you can feel comfortable working with them, but just like not interacting too close. And last but not least is a public space, which resembles the space for public speaking or giving a class. The perception of the levels of intimacy in these spaces is culturally determined. What for some cultures might be a distance that they have with friends might feel either like too close to others, while in other cultures might be feeling too far away from others. Here, the range of emotions from these relations can go in very different directions. When, let's think, for example, when someone gets too close, it might be described as invasive, while staying too far away from each other could be considered cold or even rude. But how does this translate in a world where we are all working remotely? There are multiple demonstrations of how this affects us in workspaces. Just as a space can be considered public or intimate, when engaging in online communication, people have different definitions of what should be shared on public channels or in private ones. Sharing private information in public channels might be interpreted as an intimate, um, as kind of like exposing intimate or private information, which can end up in damaging trust. People might have a tendency to kind of like
Just a quick note, Wampa, we've got 2 minutes left.
note people may have a preference for sharing, deciding whether like they should share something like publicly and private. On the other hand, when sending a message, some folks might feel that they will interrupt someone from their work and prefer to wait until the next call to have the conversation. In other cases, people never send a message. Their counterparts can see this as avoidant or poor communication skills, meaning, not communicating enough just because they feel that they will interrupt the work that they're doing. So I know we're really short on time, so I just want to make sure that we go through some of the stuff that we talked about today. So I wanted to go really fast to what we talked about today, just like, for example, in this case, external, and we talked about external culture as some of the things that we can relate to, deep culture as some of the things that we might not be aware of, but definitely have an impact on our overall relationship. And last but not least, we define 6 different dimensions that might be affecting these relations, like power distance. Countries that tend to be unequal tend to have more power distance and base themselves on hierarchies, uncertainty avoidance. Folks that, for example, tend to be in situations of war uh, tend to be tend to have like a lower uncertainty avoidance, while those that have tend to have higher uncertainty avoidance, meaning that they try to have things safe to them. Long or short-term orientation, meaning whether someone will have a long vision of themselves in the future or a short-term vision of themselves in the future, meaning that they take into consideration um, how can they build, like, let's say, like wealth and other stuff and their careers in the long term. Individualism versus collectivism, which is how much people relate to a group of people. Masculine versus feminine, which has to do with the general or traditional sense of like what's masculine and what's feminine in these countries. And last but not least, public and private spaces, what might make people feel that they can share stuff in a private space or a public space, and that they will feel they can trust these spaces to be the right place to be.